It was never meant to be a success. These days, when people think of Pennywise, they picture Bill Skarsgård and Andy Muschietti's movies, the version that turned the clown into a modern horror icon. And now, with HBO gearing up to release a prequel, this universe is only getting bigger. But before CGI, global marketing, and record-breaking box office runs, there was a 1990 TV miniseries, a small production weighed down by network pressure, a censored ending forced by ABC, and a Pennywise whose actor was literally having panic attacks on set. Nobody thought it would work, not even Stephen King himself. Yet somehow, against every expectation, it ended up haunting an entire generation. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on the story behind it. And trust me, what went down behind the scenes is darker than anything you'll find in Derry. Before it became the TV miniseries that traumatized half the planet, it was already a monster of a book. Stephen King started working on it in the early 80s, right when his career was peaking, but his personal life was spiraling. For more than a decade, he'd been turning out one bestseller after another. Carrie, The Shining, Christine, each one getting its own movie adaptation. But that pace was brutal. He was caught between publishers demanding more, his own obsession with topping every book, and addictions that were quietly taking him down. King started writing It while deep in his struggles with alcohol and drugs. Years later, he admitted there are entire chapters he has no memory of putting down on paper. And as if that wasn't enough, he was still chased by the ghosts of his childhood in Maine, especially one fear that stuck with him: clowns. That phobia, mixed with fragments of his youth and the idea of an evil force that always comes back, became the seed of one of his most ambitious works. When the novel hit shelves in 1986, it exploded. That same year, it was the best-selling book in the US, and over time it sold more than 500 million copies worldwide, turning into one of the biggest hits by the king of horror. At over 1,000 pages, the story jumped between two timelines and blended cosmic horror, intimate drama, and a coming-of-age tale. It was huge, almost too big, even for King. But that's exactly why many fans see it as the book that best captures his obsessions: the fear of growing up, the weight of memory, and the certainty that evil can take any form. Once the book became a publishing phenomenon, Hollywood wanted in. The problem? Figuring out how to squeeze a beast like this into a screen. ABC's solution was to turn it into a 2-night miniseries, just 2 episodes. That's basically like trying to cram the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy into a music video. And from day one, things were shaky. The first director lined up was George A. Romero, the guy who practically invented zombie movies, but he bailed after clashing with the network. The script was then handed to Lawrence Cohen, the same writer behind Carrie. His job was a nightmare: cut down more than 1,000 pages, rework whole sections, and somehow keep the heart of the story. That meant entire storylines got tossed, like Pennywise's cosmic origin and the psychic showdown with the turtle Maturin. The channel didn't want aliens or giant turtles anywhere near primetime TV, and the problems didn't stop there. The budget was tiny, the effects were primitive, and the network wanted it scary enough to count as horror, but not so dark that it scared away the younger viewers they were banking on. It was the kind of project where everything could go wrong. And for the people who took it on, the scars would last a lifetime. Stephen King wasn't part of the production, but his shadow loomed over every decision. Adapting one of his stories was never simple. The producers knew his books came with millions of loyal readers, and critics ready to pounce the second they messed it up. His name alone was enough to put pressure on anyone. Nobody wanted to be the one who butchered the work of a man who could terrify millions with a single line. With George Romero out and the script cut to pieces, most people figured it was already doomed. Even King was close to giving up on seeing his nightmares brought to life. But then, against all odds, someone stepped in to keep the project alive: Tommy Lee Wallace. Wallace wasn't some newbie. He'd worked side by side with John Carpenter on Halloween and later directed cult favorites like Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. He didn't have Romero's prestige, but what he did have was exactly what ABC needed: someone practical, a filmmaker who knew how to keep things moving with almost no resources. But hanging over the project was a ghost scarier than Pennywise: Stephen King's track record with directors who adapted his work. And at the center of it all was his infamous fallout with Stanley Kubrick and The Shining. We could honestly make a whole video just about that story. When King sold the rights, he had no idea he was handing over his book to someone as cold and calculating as Kubrick. The director gutted the heart of the novel, turned Jack Torrance into a straight-up psycho from the first scene, and stripped away the tragedy of the character. For King, The Shining wasn't just a haunted house story, it was a tragedy about alcoholism, redemption, and a father's slow collapse. Kubrick, with his icy, nihilistic approach, turned it into a stylized nightmare where the fear was more about aesthetics than emotion. King hated it. hated it so much he eventually wrote his own miniseries of The Shining in 1997 just to set the record straight. It aired on TV, but almost no one remembers it the way they remember Kubrick's film. Back to it. Tommy Lee Wallace tried to steer clear of any showdown with King, but it didn't matter. Once again, author and director ended up on opposite sides. The difference this time was that King wasn't nearly as scary. He was dealing with his own demons and pouring everything into his books, so he kept his distance, never weighing in on the script or the production. From afar, he just watched as others carved up his most ambitious novel to squeeze it into 2 nights of TV. For King, it was personal, written in the middle of addictions and childhood trauma. For Wallace, it was a television puzzle that had to fit together, no matter what. 2 completely different ways of looking at the same monster. Casting was the next big challenge. It had to tell 2 stories at once. The kids growing up in Derry during the 50s, and those same characters as adults in the 80s, which meant building 2 separate casts, and making sure both felt like the same people, with the same bond, the same baggage, and the same scars. The toughest part was putting together the kids' lineup. In King's novel, they were the Losers Club, but for TV they were renamed the Lucky 7. According to people who were there, the team wanted 3 things: kids who could be funny, handle tough emotional scenes, and actually look scared on camera. ABC eventually found their group. Jonathan Brandis as Bill, Emily Perkins as Beverly, and a young Seth Green as Richie Tozier, long before he became a pop culture icon in the 2000s. The adult cast was built to give the miniseries some real weight on TV. John Ritter, one of the most beloved faces in American television, stepped in as Ben Hanscom. Richard Thomas, best known from The Waltons, played the adult Bill. And Annette O'Toole gave Beverly a depth and vulnerability that contrasted with the harsher version in the novel. That mix of rising talent and established names gave the project the credibility ABC needed to bet big on primetime. And here's a wild one. Jim Carrey, long before Ace Ventura and The Mask made him a star, was almost cast as adult Eddie. In the end, Dennis Christopher got the part. Once the lineup was set, Wallace realized it wasn't enough for the kids to just hit their marks. They needed to feel like a real group, so he gathered the entire cast for a few days, even though it was expensive and a headache to organize, just to build that bond. The idea was simple. Even if the actors never shared a scene, the audience had to believe they were the same people at different stages of their lives. But while the cast was falling into place, one question kept hanging in the air. Who was going to play Pennywise? The clown was still uncast, so the first step was finding someone who could at least design the look of the monster through makeup. Bart Mixon, the makeup and effects artist, was the one tasked with giving fear a face. He had almost no time, a budget that barely covered supplies, and the weight of knowing that if Pennywise didn't land, the whole miniseries was doomed. And here's the funny part. Mixon never even read the novel cover to cover. He went off the most iconic descriptions and his own instincts. He didn't want a grotesque monster. What he wanted was way creepier. A clown who looked fun at first glance, but whose face carried the seed of a nightmare. That's how he pitched Pennywise as a living, macabre cartoon. A swollen forehead, sharp cheekbones, an oversized mouth, and a head shape just off enough to feel inhuman. The design had shades of Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera, filtered through late 80s pop culture. The result was deeply unsettling. Not a straight-up monster, but something that mixed the familiar, the childlike, and the sinister all at once. By now, the production had already done the unthinkable, kept moving when it should have fallen apart. But everyone knew the biggest test was still ahead. They couldn't drag it out any longer. King's novel could be many things. A coming-of-age story, a meditation on fear, even a cosmic epic. But to the audience, it meant one thing: Pennywise. And with the design locked in, it was time to tackle the hardest part. The fear, the fascination, the success of the entire miniseries came down to a single character. And choosing the actor who could carry that weight wasn't just important, it was the make or break decision for the whole project. So, who was going to play Pennywise? Tommy Lee Wallace had a strong cast, a script that ABC had hacked apart, but at least approved, and a makeup team working miracles on pocket change. But he was still missing the most important piece of all. He needed an actor who could flip in a heartbeat, funny and likable 1 second, terrifying the next. Someone who could carry the entire story with just a look. And the more he searched, the harder it got. King's presence haunted every meeting. What would fans think if the clown didn't measure up? And what about King himself? Who saw Pennywise as the ultimate embodiment of childhood fear? That's when the casting carousel spun into motion. First came Malcolm McDowell. Yes, Alex from A Clockwork Orange. He had the intensity, but he was too dark. Then Roddy McDowell, talented, but more staged than scary. And the weirdest option of all, Alice Cooper. The glam rock icon had the shock factor, but he was way too punk for network TV. Just when it looked like they were out of options, one name landed on the table that nobody could ignore: Tim Curry. By then, Tim Curry was already a legend. In the Rocky Horror Picture Show, he owned the screen with a character as wild as he was magnetic. In Legend, he went full devil, buried under layers of makeup and prosthetics. He had the charisma, the range, and that deep voice that could flip from sweet to threatening in a heartbeat. On paper, he was perfect, and at the same time, the worst possible choice. Because Curry hated makeup, absolutely hated it. His time in Legend had been so miserable, we even covered it in a full video here on the channel. He swore he'd never again spend hours trapped under latex and prosthetics that drained him physically and mentally, and Pennywise demanded exactly that. Hours in the chair, wigs, heavy makeup, and grueling shoot days. So when the offer landed, Curry pushed back. The thought of going through that process again was unbearable, but something in the script hooked him. Pennywise wasn't just a demonic clown, it was a cosmic predator that disguised itself as whatever drew kids in. A monster that used laughter as bait and makeup as camouflage. For an actor who had built his career playing larger-than-life villains, it was too good to walk away from. In the end, Curry said yes, but only if there were no prosthetics on his face. The effects team had already put together a monstrous design full of grotesque details, and he made them toss it out. The makeup had to stay simple, a clown that looked almost ordinary, with a bright red wig and a colorful suit, something closer to Ronald McDonald or the Joker, but with a stare sharp enough to freeze your blood. That decision changed everything. Without layers of latex holding him back, Curry could unleash his full range, stretching his grin into something unnatural, locking eyes that cut like knives, and laughing in a way that shifted from goofy to terrifying in a heartbeat. What could have ended up as a joke became the nightmare fuel of an entire generation. At last, the monster had a face. And against all odds, it wasn't an alien or some cosmic creature with tentacles. It was a clown holding balloons, with an appetite for children. Exactly what Stephen King had envisioned from the start. Wallace finally breathed easy once King signed off. The next step was clear. Head to Derry and turn that ghost town into a bloodbath. If watching it at home was unsettling, being on set was on a whole other level. The miniseries was shot in Canada, mostly around Vancouver, but New Westminster became the stand-in for Derry. Its small-town streets, Victorian houses, and quiet atmosphere made it look like it was designed for horror. For Tommy Lee Wallace, though, filming it felt less like directing and more like survival. Every day was a fight. ABC demanding changes, King's fanbase ready to pounce, and a budget that was falling apart at the seams. Wallace knew he couldn't fit a 1,000-page novel into 2 nights of TV, but he also refused to lose its soul. That pressure weighed on every choice, from which scenes to cut to how to stage a sewer using nothing but fake pipes and recycled water. And even with King miles away, his shadow never left the set. Wallace felt like he was working under the eyes of an invisible judge. His mission wasn't to replicate the book word for word, it was to make sure some part of that monster survived on screen. And somehow, against all odds, scare a primetime TV audience stiff. The shoot was chaos, a mix of tension and duct tape filmmaking. Sets were fragile, cobbled together with cardboard walls and prop pipes that had to pass for endless sewers. The budget for effects was so low that Mike's gray hair was literally baby powder brushed in with a toothbrush. Bart Mixon, head of makeup, wasn't improvising alone. The art and props teams became his lifeline, inventing ways to make walls breathe, balloons pop on cue, and drains open like mouths ready to swallow kids. Every trick was handmade, every shot a gamble in this bargain bin adaptation of a bestseller. The hardest tests came with the impossible scenes. Pennywise bursting out of a school shower, animated frame by frame so the pipes looked like twisting metal arms. And of course, the giant spider in the finale, an animatronic of latex and foam, built almost in secret by the practical effects crew. Today it might look clumsy, even silly, but in 1990 it was a huge leap for network TV. And then there was Tim Curry around the kids, a story all its own. They admired him and feared him at the same time. On set, he barely cracked a joke and kept his distance. Not because he was rude, but because he knew Pennywise needed to stay unsettling. And it worked. Years later, several of the actors admitted that just watching him walk onto the set in full makeup gave them real nightmares. No one had it tougher than Curry. Throughout the shoot, he was hit with panic attacks. The suffocating makeup, the long hours, the pressure of carrying the entire monster, it all pushed him to the breaking point. Nobody saw it at the time. Like a true stage actor, he made sure the camera never caught him slipping. But behind the white paint and sharpened teeth, Pennywise was eating away at the man behind the mask. And yet, the second the cameras rolled, Curry flipped a switch. His voice, his body, his eyes, everything shifted into Pennywise. The crew watched in silence, almost complicit in his struggle. They let the panic attacks play out, because the unsettling energy he brought to the screen couldn't be replicated any other way. They knew they were seeing something special. Even the accidents became iconic. The line, "Beep beep Richie," the way the kids shut Richie up, was completely improvised.
Beep beep Richie.
And that infamous laugh, it wasn't scripted. That was Curry. As if the chaos of the shoot and the lack of care for the cast weren't enough, one last piece was still missing. A horror story like this needed the right music, and someone had to decide who was going to write it. The one who saved the project was Richard Bellis, a composer whose career had been on hold since 1984, for reasons even he couldn't explain. By his fourth year running a carpentry business, he got the call. And just 5 weeks later, he delivered a score that blended orchestra, synths, jazz, eerie sound design, and even circus music. Some of it recorded with 55 musicians, some of it crafted in his home studio where electronic sounds came to life. Bellis didn't just write notes, he built worlds. Each member of the Losers had their own theme. Pennywise had his, and layered through it all were melodies of nostalgia, childhood, and the passing of time. His big inspiration was Bernard Herrmann, Hitchcock and Wells's go-to composer, but the execution was pure Bellis. He even swore off the tritone, the classic scary interval, because he thought it was too cliché. Even the scrapbook in the opening credits shaped the music. It wasn't a happy collage. It was empty pages and black and white photos. Bellis turned that into sound. Muted tones, mournful trumpets, and a twisted carousel for the clown. Calliope drums and bells were the obvious choices, but he bent them into something darker. He dropped the pitch, spread out the notes, and built a theme that wasn't just circus music. It was a carnival nightmare. The irony is that today, fans look back and celebrate Bellis's score. But in 1990, Wallace and the producers weren't sold on it, especially the main theme. Creative clashes between Bellis and the IT team became routine during production. At the same time, the shoot was running on fumes. Everything had to be shot fast and cheap, while somehow keeping ABC's executives happy and living up to King's fans. Wallace was stuck in the middle, the network pushing for something family-friendly on one side, and an audience expecting pure horror on the other. Add to that an actor who refused to compromise on makeup, and a group of kids who had no idea they were filming the most traumatic project of their childhood. By the last day of shooting, Wallace, Curry, and the kids celebrated like survivors. No more pressure, no more panic, no more nightmares. But that relief didn't last long. The final hurdle was still waiting: ABC's approval. The network forced changes to the ending, making it clear that if the darker scenes stayed in, the miniseries wouldn't air. And somehow all that chaos ended up helping. The tension, the discomfort, the rough edges, they all bled into the screen. And that's exactly what made it unforgettable. While Wallace was struggling with the edit, Stephen King watched from a distance with a mix of skepticism and resignation. He wasn't openly against the miniseries, but he never stood up for it either. For King, it felt like handing over his creation and having to accept whatever others did with it. Wallace, on the other hand, knew he could never match what King had envisioned, but he still had to find a way to make it work. The tortured writer and the scrappy director never met, but their names would always be tied together. King as the father of the monster, Wallace as the man who let it loose on screen. With all that hanging over the production, the miniseries finally aired on ABC in November 1990. Nobody really knew what was going to happen. For the executives, it was just another horror miniseries. For the crew, it was a draining shoot that left more scars than rewards. And for Wallace, it was a project that had barely made it across the finish line. Then came the shocker. More than 30 million people tuned in for the first episode. Airing on Sunday, November 18, 1990, it ranked as the 5th most watched show of the night. Critics were split. Some praised the atmosphere, others laughed at the giant spider. But audiences were hooked. And when Part 2 aired the following Tuesday, the numbers went even higher, climbing to the second most watched program of the day. Overnight, a miniseries made on scraps had turned into one of the biggest TV events of the decade. For Wallace, it felt like redemption. During the shoot, he was constantly on a tightrope, convinced the whole thing could collapse at any second. But looking back, he could finally see it. With creativity and sheer grit, he'd turned an unfilmable novel into a cultural phenomenon. There was still one opinion that really mattered: Stephen King's. After being burned by Kubrick's The Shining, King had become fiercely protective of his work. His reaction to it was cautious. He never slammed the adaptation, but he didn't cheer it on either. To him, it was still, above all, his book. Seeing it boiled down to 2 nights of network TV felt inevitably limited. But even King admitted that Curry's performance and the chemistry of the cast captured the essence of his story, that raw, childlike fear that never really leaves us. In his own words, Tim Curry was a great Pennywise. He genuinely scared a lot of kids back then. Over time, the It miniseries became a cult classic. For some, it's still the most faithful attempt at putting King's spirit on screen. And in the end, Wallace and King were tied together in a strange kind of pact. Neither thought it would work. Neither expected it to succeed, but it did. And it did so at the cost of unimaginable suffering. 27 years after the miniseries, the same cycle Pennywise comes back to Derry, he returned to the screen. In 2017, Argentine director Andy Muschietti released a two-part adaptation that blew up the box office and gave the clown a new face, this time played by Bill Skarsgård. There's something about the original miniseries that never left me, probably because of the impact it had when I was a kid. Anyone who's read the novel knows how hard it is to adapt for the big screen. But the sewer entrances, the bleakness of the characters, the music, and even the scrappy production gave that version a dark, unforgettable vibe. Soon, the It universe will open up again with HBO's prequel, Welcome to Derry. Set in 1962, 27 years before Muschietti's films, the series explores a new cycle of tragedies, including the infamous Black Spot Fire, a nightclub for the black community, and one of the defining horrors in Pennywise's cycle. If the 1990 miniseries was a scrappy miracle born from technical limits and corporate indifference, Welcome to Derry is its modern opposite, backed by HBO, stacked with a massive budget, written in chapters, and built straight from the book's interludes. Bill Skarsgård is back as Pennywise, while the show digs deeper into Derry's mythology and stretches out its bloody history. But even with all the hype, one thing hasn't changed: Tim Curry's laugh. The Pennywise of 1990, those wicked eyes, that voice flipping from comedy to nightmare in a heartbeat, still sets the bar every new version has to live up to. The miniseries that was never meant to succeed ended up as an unlikely classic, a bridge between generations. Stephen King poured his demons into over 1,000 pages. Tommy Lee Wallace squeezed them into 2 nights of network TV, and Tim Curry gave them a face no one would ever forget, because the truth is it never really left. It was just waiting for the right moment.